Today we're going to talk about stacking phrases and dependent clauses. Now we know that in order to build a complex sentence, you must first begin with a foundation, and that foundation is the independent clause. Our independent clause would be, life consisted of getting up, hurrying to school, and then hurrying back home. The actor is life, the action is consisted, and then we have a series of answers. Now we know that if we want, we can add an external phrase or external dependent clause to the beginning of this independent clause. Before the chaos, life had consisted of getting up, hurrying to school, and then hurrying back home. Now we did two things here. First of all, we set off the external phrase before the chaos with a comma, which is something you always have to do when it's external. And the second thing we did was we changed the verb of the foundational clause from just consisted to had consisted. And we did that to kind of show the repetitive nature of what life had been in the before time, so to speak. Now here's the interesting part. If we wanted, we could add an extra external phrase or dependent clause onto the phrase before the chaos. Again, because it's external, we must set it off with a comma. Before the terrible times, before the chaos, life had consisted of getting up, hurrying to school, and then hurrying back home. Both phrases, you might notice, are parallel. They both begin with the word before. Sometimes you might want to do that to kind of create a rhythm with your phrases. But remember, as long as they're both phrases or dependent clauses and you set them off with commas, you can stack them onto the foundational clause. We can also stack external phrases and dependent clauses onto the end of an independent clause. Our new independent clause would be, the smell greeted him when he walked in. One of my favorite cliches I see almost every year in my English classes. For some reason, smells are always very polite, and they're saying hello whenever anybody enters a room. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that independent clause and we're going to add a phrase onto it. The smell greeted him when he walked in. A terrible smell. But we know we can also stack a phrase or dependent clause onto that phrase as long as we set it off with a comma. The smell greeted him when he walked in. A terrible smell. Terrible enough to make him gag. Now we can also take an independent clause and interrupt it with external information. Our new independent clause would be, the smell punched him in the face. Another one of my favorite cliches, smells are either very polite or very rude. So when we break this up between the actor and the action, we might get something like, the smell wafting through the house punched him in the face. Another thing that smells love to do is waft. I'm not sure why. But anyway, what we did here was we didn't use commas to set off the external information. Instead, I used an em dash. And the reason I did that is because I know this is going to be a longer pause, and the em dash works really well with long pauses, especially in the middle of independent clauses. Now, if I'm going to stack an additional phrase or dependent clause onto the phrase wafting through the house, I must set it off with a comma. The new sentence reads, the smell wafting through the house, filling up every room, punched him in the face. Now we can take everything we've learned over the last 9 lessons and put it all together. We can begin with an independent clause. I was suddenly conscious of the movement in the valley. Now that we have this foundation, we can build on it. We know how to. We can add an external phrase in front of that independent clause. Standing there wrapped in my own stillness, I was suddenly conscious of the movement in the valley. But we don't have to stop there. We can further define what this movement in the valley is by the use of a colon. Well, that movement is the narrow stream tracing its way downward from the mountain. And if we wanted, we could tack on an additional phrase to that phrase, further defining the movement in the valley. Gliding silkily over smooth stones. And we don't have to stop there. We might want to add a new movement to the valley. And since we are no longer talking about the narrow stream gliding silkily over smooth stones, we're going to set off that new chunk of movement with something called a semicolon, something we haven't talked a lot about yet. We're going to define the new movement in the valley as furtive, shadowed creatures darting through dense underbrush or skipping lightly from branch to branch. And yet I still don't feel quite finished. I want to even further define that movement in the valley, so I'm going to add another semicolon and give another chunk of information. And far off, a single automobile entering from the highway, winding steadily nearer. 2 additional phrases, and of course I did set them apart with a comma, yet one more giant chunk of information defining that movement in the valley. And yet, because I am crazy, I am still not done. I'm going to define that automobile as the first in weeks, and I'm going to use an em dash to set that information off because technically it doesn't really deal with movement in the valley. And my new monster sentence reads, Standing there wrapped in my own stillness, I was suddenly conscious of the movement in the valley, the narrow stream tracing its way downward from the mountain, gliding silkily over smooth stones, furtive shadowed creatures darting through dense underbrush or skipping lightly from branch to branch, and far off a single automobile, the first in weeks, entering from the highway, winding steadily nearer. And we built this monster sentence from a simple independent clause. And because we know how to tack on phrases and clauses onto independent clauses, and because we know how to use colons and em dashes, we can create sentences like this when we need them. As always, thanks for joining me, everyone, and I hope to see you next time. Have a great day. Bye-bye.